Hi, thanks for joining me today. My name is Ann Crawford, and I'm the Reference and Adult Services Librarian at the Ponte Vedra Beach Branch Library. Chances are you're checking out this program because you've just read the library book, our St. John's Read selection for 2021, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I know that I did. And one of the things that I enjoy when I finish a really, really good book is I want to read more on that topic or more on that subject or more, just more. And unfortunately, at the end of a really good book, unless it's got a sequel or several sequels, that's generally the end. But there are always something called read-alikes that you can check into. And read-alikes are something that librarians like myself are helping patrons find every single day. They'll come in and they'll tell us, I've read all the books by this author. Can you recommend anything else I could read that's similar to what I've read before and that I really enjoyed? Or I really enjoyed this specific book. Do you have anything else like it in your library's collection? So that's something we really enjoy doing. It's called Reader's Advisory, and it's a lot of fun. And of course, to be better at Reader's Advisory, you've just got to read a lot of books, which any librarian enjoys and probably would agree with me, you never quite have as much time for as you'd like to. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about the library book without spoilers, of course, and talk to you about different books that we have in our library's collection that are similar to the library book, or maybe touch on some of the topics that comes up in the story. But before I jump ahead of myself, what is the library book? Maybe, like I said, you've already read it so you know, or maybe you're about to read it, in which case, like I said, no spoilers. So the library book is a work of nonfiction, and it's not just about a library or what happens in a library or even behind the scenes in a library, which, believe it or not, is a lot more intricate and even interesting than maybe you're aware of. It's about a true crime that occurred at a library, namely the Los Angeles Public Library, which burned in the 1980s. Yes, we're talking about something many, many decades ago, and is still unsolved to this day, which is sort of mind-blowing. Like, how is this mystery still unsolved? But it is, and that is a big part of what the library book is about. Now, I've often been heard to say that the library book is really a love letter to libraries, and that may sound really confusing when I've just told you it's a story about true crime. How could a story about true crime, arson in fact, with a library possibly be a love letter to libraries? Well, that's one of the things I enjoyed about the library book. It was about true crime, yes, and for the person who started the fire may not have been as fond of the library as everyone else in the community. But when that library burned, and burned significantly, and burned right in front of the librarians and the patrons standing outside and watching, with tears often rolling down their face, one thing became very clear. In the aftermath of this event, with all the smoke and the water damage, and just, I can only imagine how horrific that scene must have been when someone walked back into that library and just seeing the incredible amounts of damage, was the overflowing love that came out of the community. So many people came out to support their library and to clean up the mess. And it wasn't just library staff, and it wasn't just library volunteers or even friends of the library. It was patrons, it was people in the community who couldn't imagine not having that library right around the corner and all the many resources that it offered. It was city officials that made it a point to help put the library back together, and what a mammoth job that it was. And what's really interesting is that now, if you go to the Los Angeles Public Library, and if you didn't know about the fire, you wouldn't necessarily know when it ever occurred, except there's a part of the library where if you open certain books, you could still smell the slightest tinge of smoke. So that's what I was going to talk about today. True crime, as it relates to the library. Who knew? True crime and libraries actually go together. And that's really kind of an amazing thing to think about. But libraries have popped up in a lot of parts of history. They've been a part of many wars. Many libraries have burned long before, and hopefully not too far after, the Los Angeles Public Library. And also some really interesting things that happen in libraries that you wouldn't expect. Certainly I didn't before I deep dove into these books. Particularly this first one that looks pretty harmless. It's called Dark Archives. And you might be wondering, what does it mean by Dark Archives? Well, I'll introduce this book by saying there's a expression out there that says you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. And while literally it means you shouldn't decide you know what a book is about literally by looking at its cover, of course, figuratively it's about, not judging people or situations just by appearances. But what if I told you to not judge a book by its binding? And you might think about, well, how are books bound anyway? Well, if you ask a librarian that's been around for a while, like me, I've been a librarian for 17 years, they'll be the first to tell you that books were so much better made when the bindings were sewn, as opposed to the bindings being glued, which they are now, which unfortunately, especially in Florida's heat and humidity, don't tend to hold up as well as they used to. But what I found out here in Dark Archives, which was quite a bit of a shock to me, was I found out that a librarian like myself had decided that she had found out about some books she just couldn't believe were true, and decided to deep dive into an investigation of books bound in human skin. That's right, you heard me correctly. There are books in this world that were bound in human skin many years ago. Now, on the surface, again, if you're judging a book by its binding, that sounds a little bit like Hannibal Lecter's library, and I promise you, it's not that. It sounds like it. It's not that. This book is much more akin to The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, or even the newer book, The Organ Thieves. The idea that people pass away and then things are done with their bodies without their express permission, without their family's express permission. Like I said, she deep dove into this investigation and found out why we have books bound in human skin, where they can be found, how this whole thing came about, and all the many details. So if you like your books a little bit on the darker side of libraries, then I really recommend Dark Archives, which we own in print as well as in ebook. It's just a really surprising book that you probably didn't expect me to talk about today, but I thought it'd be a good way to kick it off. Now, going back to true crime, there's been all sorts of crimes that have come about with relation to books, and I thought this was really interesting when I put together this presentation. And this one is called The Book Thieves, the Nazi Looting of Europe's Libraries and the Race to Return a Literary Inheritance. So what's really interesting in this book is that in World War II, you may already be aware of this, or you may not be, but that in World War II, one of the things that Nazis did with libraries was they didn't destroy the libraries, they didn't burn the libraries, they simply expunged all the books out of the library that went against their credo, went against what they were going to make a point of teaching. So anything that went against their manifesto of sorts, out it went. So the only things that were left in the library were things that supported their point of view. And if you're someone who comes and visits our library or any of our libraries in St. Johns County or libraries across the country, you know that we are open to the public. It means we are open to everyone, meaning that in theory, you should be able to walk into your library and find something that reflects back a part of yourself. It shouldn't all be one voice, one color, one religion, one anything. It should be a representation of all the things that one can find in a community. But that's not what the Nazis were after, and that's what this book talks about. And so you can see libraries being used as tools, not for their intended purpose, but for the purpose that someone has decided that they will be used for. Because libraries are supposed to be places that, are community centers, that are information warehouses, that are places where people can not only learn about themselves, but learn about the wider world. But of course, in this book, that was not the aim. So that's The Book Thieves. But going back to burning books, the Los Angeles Public Library was not the first library fire that was out there. So we've got Burning the Books, A History of Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge. So it's similar to The Book Thieves in the sense that There are been instances in history where, for any number of reasons, any number of different individuals or groups have decided that there was information that no one deserved to have. They didn't agree with it, they didn't believe in it, ergo it needed to go. And so that's what this book chronicles, about the different times in history whereby libraries and or books have burned. And that was a real eye-opener, because as stunning as it was to read about the Los Angeles Public Library fire, which, of course, hit near and dear to my heart. I can't imagine our library burning to the ground, but I know that our patrons and community would rally back and do all they could to bring the library back. It was a bit stunning and shocking to read about all the different instances that libraries and books have burned over the centuries, over the many of centuries, and for any number of different reasons. So again, tying into the library book about arson and why it occurs, and who are the people who commit these acts, and what was the reasoning. So a lot of food for thought. Like I said, since the library fire is still unsolved to this day, although if you read the library book, Susan Orlean, the author, has a pretty good idea of who she thinks may be responsible, and she gives a very compelling case. I won't say who it is. It gives you some insight into why a library fire might be started by somebody. Now this book, Patience and Fortitude, you may recognize this line from the New York Public Library. Apparently the two lines in front of the New York Public Library are Patience and Fortitude. And this is about power, real estate, and the fight to save a public library. And immediately that drew me in, because one of the times that I went to New York City, I saw the New York Public Library, and it is stunning. I'm not even just talking about the inside, I'm just from the outside, it is just breathtaking. I mean, it is so much a library, and it's mammoth. It's like a library and museum and history all just rolled into one. And what I found out in this book is there was a time that there was a plan to sell multiple branches of the library system, including that library, to turn it over for real estate. And I thought, I couldn't imagine New York City without the New York Public Library. And yet that was on the table until patrons and authors and artists and actors and a whole slew of community people came together and said, absolutely not. And they rallied back, they fought back, they petitioned, and they saved the library. So that was really inspiring, that this library generated so much love and devotion that the people weren't going to let it go. They weren't going to let it get turned into real estate, that they put their foot down and said, absolutely not, the library stays. So even in these instances where these horrible things are happening, just like in the library book, where you think, oh my gosh, somebody tried to burn the library down, therein comes the inspiration of, wow, so many people cared about that library, loved that library meant something to them and positively affected their lives. They were willing to go out and do something about it. So really inspiring. We've got Torn from Their Bindings, a story of art, science, and the pillaging of American university libraries. So now we're switching from public libraries to academic libraries. And long story short, we have someone in here who's decided that certain books have inserts in them. You probably checked out some from our library before. They have little inserts in them. Well, in these particular academic libraries, these inserts were one of a kind. So someone got the idea to go from academic library to academic library to academic library and steal the inserts and resell them. Mind-blowing. Now, you might be thinking, well, what is an academic library exactly? Well, an academic library is a library connected to an institution, a college or a university. So this was a big thing, somebody going through these books and stealing these inserts and reselling them for huge prices, and what it took to track down this individual, because there wasn't necessarily a pattern or kind of a MO that was immediately, modus operandi, I should say. immediately establish what this person was doing. It took them a while to figure it out. But it just goes to show, theft and fires and shutting down of libraries and selling them for real estate. I mean, there's a lot of drama going on with libraries that you probably never knew about. I know I didn't know nearly as much about it than before I did this. Now, one of the things that I love about the library book is it talks about what happens in libraries, not just what you see out on the front lines as a patron, but all the inner workings of a library. Like when you request a book, all the things that have to happen to get that book into your hands at your library, how books are ordered, how books are bound, how they're repaired, all the different little intricacies, I should say, that come together to make it all happen. And so that's a really incredible journey. And that's one of the things that is cataloged, if you will, in the library, a catalog of wonders, just talking about how the library comes together in order to serve you. And it's a lot more intricate and interesting than you might think that it is. It looks seamless on the front, but there's a lot of moving pieces behind the scenes to give you your materials that you're looking for, your programming, your meeting spaces, everything. So a lot of really good books to read. Of course, Dear Fahrenheit 451, a librarian's love letters and breakup notes in the books in her life. So many of you have said that you find books to be biographical, or rather autobiographical, and it's true. Just like when you hear a particular song on the radio, sometimes you're like, oh man, that takes me back. Books are the same way. You remember the very first time that you read a particular book, or you read a book and suddenly the place that it takes part in, or the characters, or what's happening, trigger all these emotions and memories and feelings, and that's what's going on in this book. And a fun fact for you, if you didn't know this already, with Fahrenheit 451, 451 is the number of degrees it takes to burn a book. And I want to say in the library book that the person that wrote Fahrenheit 451 spent some time in that particular library before it burned, writing that particular book, which is, we get a little shivers here, a little spooky. But this is a great book of just showing how autobiographical books can be, and how much not so much that they say about you as a person, but how they inform your life, how they tell your story, and how they can help you learn other people's stories and gain so much more empathy. And of course, Ex Libris, 100 books to read and reread. So this is a great title if you're looking for that next great read, or something that maybe just reaffirming, wow, that was a wonderful book. I need to reread that again. There's certain books every year that when I get the opportunity, I just have to go back and give them another read, because it's just such a comforting feeling. I remember the first time I read it, and I find something new in the story every time. So if you're looking for a suggestion for a great new read, Ex Libris may be your ticket. So that is the end of part 1 of my presentation today. And I have more books to share with you in part 2, and I hope you'll join me for that as well. Don't forget, get your St. Johns County Library card out, and right after the end of this presentation, there'll be a book list of all the titles that I've shared today, and at the end of part 2, there'll be another book list sharing the rest of the titles that I'll share in that presentation. So until next time, happy reading.